Maybe now everyone will understand why I couldn't stay married to someone who never wanted more from life. Daniel Carter pulled off his wedding ring in front of 400 employees and threw it onto the ballroom floor at his own company's celebration. He didn't whisper it, he announced it, into a microphone, with his hand already reaching for Madison Reed's waist before his wife had even turned to walk away. Charlotte Whitmore didn't scream, she didn't cry. She simply looked at the ring lying on the floor, then looked at her husband and said nothing. Because Daniel Carter had no idea that the woman he just humiliated in front of his entire company had purchased every share of Summit Horizon Technologies that same morning. If this is your first time here, welcome. Please subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Charlotte Whitmore had spent 8 years perfecting the art of being invisible. Not because she lacked confidence, not because she was afraid, but because she had made a deliberate, calculated choice to disappear into the background of her own marriage, a choice that had cost her more than she ever expected and taught her more than she ever anticipated. At every Summit Horizon Company dinner, every annual gala, every informal Friday gathering where Daniel liked to hold court with his management team and their spouses, Charlie stood near the edge of the room with a glass of sparkling water, smiled when someone glanced her way, and answered the same question with the same practiced response. "And what is it that you do, Charlie?" "Oh, I run a small online business from home." "Nothing exciting, you know how it is," and they would nod. They would smile politely, and they would turn back to Daniel. Because Daniel was the exciting one, Daniel was the CEO. Daniel was the reason Summit Horizon Technologies had grown from a regional software startup into one of the Pacific Northwest's most talked about tech companies. Daniel was charming, articulate, relentlessly ambitious, and he wore his success the way some men wear cologne heavily, and in every room he entered. Nobody ever thought twice about his quiet wife, which was exactly what Charlie had intended. The night everything changed was a Thursday in October. The kind of October night in Seattle where the air carries that cold clarity that makes everything feel a little too sharp, a little too real. Summit Horizon's annual celebration was held at the Cascade Grand Ballroom, a venue Daniel had specifically chosen because it could accommodate 400 people, and because, as he told his executive assistant the week before, "I want everyone to see what we've built." Charlie arrived in a simple navy dress. She had done her own hair. She wore pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother. She did not hire a stylist, not because she couldn't afford one, but because she had long ago stopped dressing for other people's approval. She found her seat at the third table from the left, not the head table, where the executives sat with their polished partners, and settled in beside Margaret Holloway, the head of Summit Horizon's legal compliance department, who was one of the few people in that building who had ever treated Charlie like a complete human being, rather than a decorative accessory. "You look lovely," Margaret said, and she meant it. "You're being kind," Charlie said. "I'm being accurate," Margaret replied, and refilled Charlie's water glass without being asked. "Daniel's been in the back room for the last 40 minutes. He seems, I don't know, wound up about something." Charlie didn't answer that. She simply watched the room fill up around her. She noticed Madison Reed almost immediately. Madison was 29 years old, head of digital product development, and had been with Summit Horizon for 14 months. She was the kind of woman who entered a room and immediately reorganized its gravitational field. She was sharp, ambitious, and she had a particular way of looking at Daniel. No one was watching, a look that Charlie had learned to recognize about 4 months ago. Around the same time, Daniel started coming home later and later and started flinching whenever his phone lit up in her presence. Charlie had not confronted him. She had simply started paying closer attention. 40 minutes into the dinner, after the appetizers had been cleared and the speeches were beginning, Daniel took the microphone. He was at ease up there. He always had been. He had a gift for making rooms lean toward him, for making people feel like they were receiving something valuable just by listening to him speak. 8 years ago, he said, looking out at the crowd with that easy, practiced smile. I stood in a tiny office on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like copy paper and broken dreams. And I told my first 3 employees that we were going to change the way businesses think about software infrastructure. Tonight, looking out at all of you, every single person who believed in that vision, I want you to know that what we've accomplished together is something extraordinary. The room applauded. Daniel smiled. He let it wash over him the way he let most good things wash over him deeply, and as though he had earned every second of it. Then something shifted. Charlie felt it before she saw it. A change in the air, a stillness that didn't belong in a room full of celebrating people. Daniel's eyes found hers across the tables, and the smile didn't fade exactly. It transformed into something else, something she hadn't seen on his face before. Something that looked terrifyingly like relief. "Before I close," he said, his voice dropping just enough to make the room lean in further, "I want to address something personal. Because I believe in honesty. And I think the people who've built this company with me deserve to know the truth about where I'm standing." Margaret set down her fork. Charlie did not move. "My marriage," Daniel said, "is over." A murmur moved through the crowd like a wave. "I've been carrying this for a while, and tonight, in front of everyone I respect and everyone who has supported this company, I want to start fresh." He looked directly at Charlie. "Maybe now everyone will understand why I couldn't stay married to someone who never wanted more from life." And then he reached up with his right hand, slid his wedding ring off his finger, and held it up so that everyone could see it. Then he dropped it. It hit the ballroom floor with a small, clear sound that seemed, in that terrible silence, much louder than it had any right to be. The ring rolled 3 inches, stopped, lay still. Charlie looked at it. 400 people looked at Charlie. Madison Reed, standing just behind Daniel's left shoulder, pressed her lips together and said nothing. Margaret Holloway put her hand on the table between herself and Charlie. A quiet, deliberate gesture, offering something without saying a word. And Charlie Charlotte Whitmore, who had hidden her identity for 8 years, who had built an empire no one in this room knew existed, who had spent a full decade learning when to be silent and when to be devastating, looked up from the ring on the floor, looked at her husband, and said nothing at all. She simply stood, she picked up her clutch, she turned, and she walked out of the ballroom. The click of her heels on the marble floor was the only sound in the room. Outside, the Seattle air was cold and exact. She walked to her car, sat down behind the wheel, and placed both hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine. Her phone buzzed. "Victoria Lawson," she answered it. "I saw the live stream," Victoria said immediately. There was no preamble. Victoria never wasted words. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Charlie said. "That's not what I asked." A pause. "The acquisition closed this morning," Charlie said. "All the shares, every last one," Victoria confirmed. Summit Horizon Technologies is officially a wholly owned subsidiary of Aurelia Capital Group of 9:47 this morning. "We have full board authority. You're the owner of record." Charlie was quiet for a moment. "He doesn't know yet," she said. "No, the announcement was suppressed by agreement until you decided how to move forward. The legal team has been extraordinarily discreet." Another pause. "Charlie, what do you want to do?" Charlotte Whitmore closed her eyes. She thought about the ring on the ballroom floor. She thought about 400 people watching to see if she would fall apart. She thought about her mother standing in the kitchen of their small apartment in Portland, hands still damp from washing dishes, looking at a 10-year-old Charlie with total certainty and saying, "Never let anyone decide your value. Build something that belongs to you." She opened her eyes. "Let him enjoy tonight," she said. "I want to understand everything before we move." "Understood," Victoria said. "The audit team is ready. Tell them to start Monday." She ended the call, sat in the silence for another moment, then started the engine and drove home alone. What most people in that ballroom did not know, what almost no one in Charlie's life had ever known, was that Charlotte Whitmore had not always been the woman she appeared to be. She had not always been quiet, she had not always been patient, and she had most certainly not always been rich. She had been born Charlotte Ann Whitmore, the only child of Elizabeth Whitmore, a registered nurse who worked double shifts at Providence Medical Center for 31 years and raised her daughter on the principle that hard work without strategy was just exhaustion, and that strategy without courage was just planning. Elizabeth Whitmore was not a woman who believed in waiting to be rescued. She believed in building exits. She believed in knowing exactly where the door was before the fire started. Charlie's father had left when she was 7. He had told Elizabeth with a kind of casual cruelty that Charlie would not fully understand until she was an adult, that she was ordinary, that she had never been what he imagined when he pictured his future, that he was sorry but he needed someone who inspired him. Elizabeth had held her head very still while he said it. Then she had told him where the door was. Then she had sat down at the kitchen table and made a list. Charlie had watched from the hallway, and even at 7, she understood something important was happening. Her mother was not collapsing, she was calculating. That kitchen table became something sacred in Charlie's memory. It was where Elizabeth studied for her advanced nursing certification. It was where Charlie did her homework every night through middle school, high school, college. It was where Elizabeth told Charlie, the week before Charlie left for university, "The world will try to make you feel small because small is manageable. Don't let them manage you." Charlie had been 24 when she sat at her own small kitchen table in a one-bedroom apartment in Portland, not the nice part, and began building Aurelia Health Systems. She had seen the problem clearly. She had spent summers during college doing administrative work at 3 different hospital networks, and what she witnessed was a system drowning in its own inefficiency. Patient records that didn't communicate with each other. Scheduling systems that crashed during peak hours. Billing processes so fragmented that hospitals were losing millions of dollars annually to errors that a well-designed platform could eliminate in weeks. She knew what the solution looked like. She had sketched it out during boring conference calls and quiet lunch breaks for 2 years. She had the architecture, she had the logic. What she needed was money and credibility and someone willing to listen. The money she borrowed, carefully, from every legitimate source available to her, including a small business loan that took 4 months to process and came with an interest rate that made her stomach hurt every time she thought about it. The credibility was harder. She pitched 22 investors in 11 months. 17 of them said no immediately. 3 asked condescending questions about whether she had a technical co-founder, meaning a man. 1 told her with a straight face that healthcare innovation wasn't built by someone sitting at a kitchen table. "You'd be surprised," she said calmly, "what gets built at kitchen tables." He did not fund her, but she remembered that conversation for a long time afterward. She kept it like a stone in her pocket, heavy and useful. The 22nd investor was a woman named Patricia Ellison, who ran a small women-led venture fund out of San Francisco and who had made her own fortune in medical logistics before anyone believed that sector was worth taking seriously. Patricia read Charlie's entire business plan in one sitting, asked 12 very specific and very intelligent questions, and then said, "You're missing a crucial piece in your revenue modeling for small rural hospital systems. Fix it and come back." Charlie fixed it in 9 days. She came back. Patricia funded her. 2 years later, Aurelia Health Systems was operating in 14 hospital networks across the Pacific Northwest. 4 years later, it was in 47 networks across 12 states. 6 years later, it was a billion-dollar company. And Charlie was still sitting at kitchen tables, still asking uncomfortable questions, still running every major decision through the same filter her mother had given her. Does this protect something real? Or does this just protect my ego? She never became famous. That was a deliberate choice. From the beginning, she had structured Aurelia in a way that kept her name off the public-facing documentation. She appointed executives to visible roles. She operated through investment holding groups that had their own names, their own press releases, their own carefully managed public identities. The people who knew who really owned Aurelia were a very small circle. Victoria Lawson, who had been her first hire and remained her most trusted ally. Patricia Ellison, who sat on the private board. a handful of attorneys and accountants bound by non-disclosure agreements that had been written with extraordinary care. Everyone else saw exactly what Charlie allowed them to see. Which is why, when she met Daniel Carter at a coffee Capitol Hill on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, she had spilled her coffee while reaching for her laptop. He had handed her napkins and laughed in that easy, unguarded way of his. She made the decision that would define the next 8 years of her life. She would not tell him. She wanted to know what it felt like to be chosen for herself. Not for her money, not for her connections, not for what her name could open for someone. She had spent years watching people treat wealth like a personality trait, like it was the most interesting thing about a person, and she had grown quietly sick of it. She wanted someone to fall in love with Charlotte. Not with the portfolio behind her, and for a while, for a long, beautiful, complicated, while Daniel had been that person. He was bright and driven, and he made her laugh, genuinely laugh, in ways she hadn't expected. He called her on his lunch breaks. He remembered that she preferred tea to coffee after 11 in the morning. He drove 4 hours to Portland with her when her mother had a health scare and sat in the hospital, waiting room without complaining 6 hours, for 6 hours, and never once made her feel like she owed him anything for it. She had loved him. That was the part that made everything else so difficult. She had genuinely, completely, without reservation loved the man. And somewhere in the 5th and 6th years, somewhere between his company's valuation hitting a milestone that put his face on the cover of a Pacific Northwest business publication, and the first time he mentioned at dinner that maybe she should think about doing something more visible with her time, something had shifted. He started talking about her the way people talked about a pleasant decoration, acknowledging her presence without engaging with it, referring to her little online business at company events with a tone that communicated to everyone in earshot that it was a hobby, not a career. She started noticing things, the flinch when his phone lit up, the vagueness about where he'd been, the way his eyes stopped finding hers across rooms. And Madison Reed. Charlie had watched Madison for months before the ballroom. She was not angry at Madison. Madison was us, and she had worked hard for her position, and she had made choices that were her own to make. Charlie's feelings about Madison were complicated and layered in the way that honest feelings usually are. She did not hate her. She pitied her slightly, in the specific way that you pity someone who doesn't yet understand what they've gotten themselves into. But when Daniel threw that ring onto the ballroom floor, when he stood at that microphone and used their marriage as a prop in his own self-mythology, when he looked at her in front of 400 people and implied that she was not enough, had never been enough, was in fact evidence of a man held back rather than a woman worth loving. Something settled in Charlie's chest with absolute clarity. She had been patient long enough. She had been quiet long enough. And now, for the first time in 8 years, she was going to stop hiding. Monday morning, the audit team arrived at Summit Horizons headquarters in South Lake Union. They introduced themselves as representatives of the new ownership group, which was technically accurate, and began the process of reviewing the company's financial records, operational structure, and internal governance documentation. Daniel was not immediately alarmed by this. Acquisitions happened. New owners wanted to understand what they'd purchased. He assumed the kind of breezy confidence that had insulated him from self-doubt for most of his adult life, that the audit would confirm what he believed, that Summit Horizon was a well-run, profitable, growing company, and that whoever had purchased it would quickly realize they needed him in order to preserve that value. He spent Monday in back-to-back meetings with his management team, reassuring them that the transition would be seamless, that his relationships with the new ownership group were already developing positively, and that everyone's positions were secure. He believed most of what he was saying. By Tuesday afternoon, the lead auditor, a woman named Sandra Okafor, who had spent 20 years doing forensic financial reviews and who had a remarkable ability to remain completely expressionless in situations that would make other people visibly requested access to a second tier of financial documentation, specifically vendor contracts from the previous 3 years. Daniel approved the request. He told his assistant to cooperate fully. He was not yet worried, but Sandra Okafor had already found the first thing. It was a vendor contract for software consulting services, valued at $800,000, awarded to a company called Horizon Bridge Partners. The contract had been approved directly by Daniel. The company had been founded 14 months earlier. Its sole registered officer was a man named Trevor Carter. Daniel's younger brother. Sandra wrote the name down in her notes and moved to the next folder. By Wednesday, she had found 3 more, and by Thursday she was on the phone with Victoria Lawson at 6:15 in the morning. "You need to see this," Sandra said. Victoria did not ask unnecessary questions. She called Charlie immediately. Charlie listened to the summary in silence. When Victoria finished, Charlie asked one question. "How deep does it go?" Victoria paused for a moment before answering. "Deep enough," she said, "that this is no longer just about your marriage." Charlie absorbed that. "Tell Sandra to document everything," she said. "Every contract, every name, every number. I want a complete picture before I make any move." "And Daniel?" Charlie looked out the window at the gray Seattle morning. "He'll find out when I decide it's time," she said. Not a moment before, she put the phone down. She sat at the kitchen table in the house she had shared with Daniel for 6 years, the table where she had done more work than he had ever imagined, and she opened her laptop. She had a company to understand and a decision to make. She was not thinking about revenge. She was thinking about the 400 employees who showed up to Summit Horizon every day, believing they were building something honest. She was thinking about the people who had been quietly pushed aside to make room for Daniel's loyalists. She was thinking about what it meant to actually have power, not the kind Daniel performed on stages with microphones and expensive suits, but the kind that changed things. The kind that protected people. The kind her mother had meant all those years ago when she said, "Build something that belongs to you." Charlie had built something, and now she had to decide what to do with it. She already knew the answer. She had known it in some quiet and certain part of herself from the moment that Ring hit the ballroom floor. But knowing what you're going to do and being ready to do it are 2 different things. And Charlotte Whitmore, who had spent 8 years learning patience, was not going to rush the most important move of her life. She would be ready, and when she was, Daniel Carter would finally understand exactly who he had thrown away. Sandra Okafor did not look like a woman who enjoyed delivering bad news. She looked like a woman who had delivered enough of it that she had learned to carry it carefully, the way you carry something fragile across a long distance steadily, without unnecessary movement, without letting her face show how heavy it actually was. She had been doing forensic financial reviews for 22 years. She had walked into boardrooms in 5 different countries and told powerful men that the numbers they'd been reporting did not match the numbers that actually existed. She had watched CFOs cry. She had watched executives go pale and reach for their phones. She had watched one man in Houston stand up from his chair, walk to the window, and stare at the parking lot below for 4 full minutes before he said a single word. She was not easily surprised. But what she was finding inside Summit Horizon's financial records, layer by layer, folder by folder, contract by contract, was surprising her. In the particular way that things surprise you, not because they are shocking in isolation, but because of how long they had been allowed to continue. It was Wednesday evening when she called her assistant, a young man named James who had been with her for 3 years, and who had developed the same ability to remain calm in escalating situations, and told him to order dinner because neither of them was leaving the building until they had mapped the complete vendor relationship structure for the past 36 months. James ordered Thai food without asking what she wanted, because he already knew, and spread the containers across the conference table between stacks of printed contracts. "How bad is it?" he asked. Sandra picked up her chopsticks and looked at the wall where they had started mapping the connections. "It's organized," she said. "That's what makes it bad. Disorganized fraud is usually just greed running out of control. This is structured." Someone thought about this. James looked at the wall. Carter himself. Carter approved everything. Whether he designed everything is a different question. She paused. But he approved everything, including the ones that should have triggered an automatic compliance review and didn't. James was quiet for a moment, because the compliance review process reported to him. Yes, Sandra said, because the compliance review process reported to him. She ate her noodles in silence for a moment, then she picked up the next contract. By the time Charlie arrived at the temporary audit office, Thursday morning, not Summit Horizon's main floor, but a separate suite that Victoria had arranged specifically to maintain separation. Sandra had 47 documents spread across 2 conference tables and a very specific expression on her face that Charlie had seen before on people who were about to tell her something that would change the shape of a situation entirely. Charlie poured her own coffee, sat down, and said, "Walk me through it." Sandra walked her through it. It took 1 hour and 40 minutes. When Sandra finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Charlie looked at the documents spread across the table. She looked at the names connected by Sandra's careful notation lines. She looked at the numbers. Horizon Bridge Partners, she said. Trevor Carter, his brother, $800,000 in the first contract. Another contract 6 months later for a technology assessment engagement, another $400,000. A third for what was documented as ongoing strategic advisory services, valued at $1.2 million over 18 months, with no deliverables specified in the contract language. Sandra paused. No deliverables specified in a contract worth $1.2 million. And Trevor Carter's company, Charlie said, what did it actually produce? Our technology review found no evidence of any work product associated with either the assessment engagement or the advisory contract. No reports, no presentations, no emails documenting strategic advice received. The folder in Summit Horizon's system associated with the advisory contract contains 3 documents. One is the contract itself, one is a series of invoices. The third is a lunch receipt from a restaurant in Bellevue. Charlie absorbed that. What else? She said. Sandra turned to the second table. 3 additional vendor relationships with similar structures. 2 of them connected to individuals who can be linked through corporate registration records to people in Daniel Carter's personal network. The third is less clear. The ownership structure has been layered in a way that takes more time to trace, and I've asked my forensic accountings associate to continue that thread. She picked up a separate folder. There's also the matter of the promotion and compensation records. Charlie looked up. 14 employees have been promoted within the last 2 years. Of those 14, 11 have personal connections to Daniel Carter or members of his immediate team that predate their employment to Summit Horizon. 3 of them have compensation packages that are, in our assessment, significantly above market rate for their roles and documented performance levels. Sandra set the folder down carefully. At the same time, we've identified 7 employees whose performance reviews rated them as top performers across multiple consecutive years, who were passed over for promotion in favor of the individuals I just described. 2 of those 7 have since left the company, and the ones who left, Charlie said, why did they leave? Sandra looked at her directly. We've only been able to document the official reasons so far. But 2 of them filed internal grievances in the months before their departure. Those grievances were reviewed by the internal HR process and closed without resolution. The HR department, during the period in question, reported directly to Daniel Carter's chief of staff. The room was quiet again. Charlie stood and walked to the window. She looked out at the city below without really seeing it. She was doing the thing she had always done when information landed hard, not reacting immediately, but letting it settle, letting it find its actual shape before she decided what to do with it. 400 employees, that was the number she kept coming back to. 400 people who got up every morning and came to work, believing that the company they were building meant something. 400 people whose promotions, whose salaries paid, whose daily work lives had been shaped in ways large and small, visible and invisible by a system designed to benefit a small circle of people who already had access. She turned back from the window. The two employees who filed grievances, she said. Can you find them? Sandra nodded slowly. With some work, yes. They're no longer with the company, so we teach them as private individuals. But yes, I believe so. I want to talk to them, Charlie said. Not through attorneys, personally, before I make any other move. Sandra made a note. One more thing, Charlie said. Madison Reed. Sandra's expression didn't change, but something in it shifted slightly, the way a person's face shifts when they are about to say something they know will land with weight. Madison Reed's trajectory inside Summit Horizon is irregular, Sandra said. She was hired 14 months ago as a mid-level product manager. Within 4 months, she was promoted to senior product manager. 3 months after that, director of digital product development. The speed of those promotions is outside Summit Horizon's own documented promotion policy timelines. And her compensation at the director level is 23% above the market median for the role in this geography. On her merit alone, Charlie asked, looking at her actual work? Her work is genuinely strong, Sandra said, and she said it without editorializing. She's a capable product manager. Some of the projects she's led have produced measurable results. The irregularity isn't in her capability, it's in the pace and the process. Promotions at that speed typically require documented exceptional circumstances and multi-level approval. We found no documentation of the approval process for either of her first 2 promotions. Charlie nodded once. Keep going on the third vendor relationship, she said. I want that ownership structure traced completely before we move to the next stage. And James, she looked at Sandra's assistant, who was standing quietly near the door. Please make sure the complete document set is secured off-site by end of day. Already done, James said. Charlie looked at him. Good, she said, and she meant it the way she always meant it when someone did their job without needing to be reminded twice. She picked up her coffee and left. In the elevator, alone, she pressed the button for the lobby and stood very still. Her marriage was over. She had already accepted that, had in some private interior space, accepted it months before the ballroom. The ring on the floor had not broken her heart so much as confirmed what she already knew. Grief worked that way sometimes. The moment of apparent rupture is rarely the actual moment the thing breaks. The actual breaking happens quietly, over time, in small increments, until one day you reach for something and find your hand closing on empty air, and you realize it's been gone for a while. What was sitting inside her chest right now was something different from grief. It was responsibility. She had purchased this company. That purchase had been set in motion months ago, initially as a defensive financial move, a way to protect her interests once she understood the marriage was ending, and once Victoria had flagged that Horizon's public valuation had created a situation where Charlie's legal exposure in a divorce proceeding needed to be carefully managed. The acquisition had been planned and executed by a team of attorneys and financial advisors who were very good at their work. But she had not known, when she initiated that process, what was actually happening inside the walls of the company. She knew now, and knowing changed the nature of what she owed. She did not owe Daniel Carter anything, that was settled. But she owed 400 people an owner who took their situation seriously. And she owed at least 2 specific people, 2 people who had tried to tell someone the truth through official channels and had been silenced, something closer to justice. The elevator doors opened. She walked out into the lobby and kept moving. By the time she reached her car, she had already decided on the next step. It was time to find the people Summit Horizon's official process had failed. Their names were in Sandra's files. Renata Osei, former senior software engineer, 6-year employee, highest-rated performer in her department for 3 consecutive years. She had filed an internal grievance 18 months ago, alleging that a promotion she had been formally recommended for had been awarded to a candidate with significantly lower performance ratings and a personal friendship with a senior executive. The grievance had been reviewed and closed. She had resigned 4 months later. The second name was Marcus Webb, former operations project manager, 8-year employee, who had filed grievance 2 years ago after documenting what he believed was a pattern of vendor selection irregularities that he had brought to the attention of his direct supervisor and been told to focus on his own work. He had resigned 14 months ago, 3 days after Summit Horizon's compliance department had sent him a formal memo reminding him of his confidentiality obligations. Charlie found Renata first. She had located a phone number through channels that were both legal and carefully discreet. She called it herself. She did not have an assistant make the call. She did not have an attorney make the call. She dialed the number herself, sitting in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the temporary audit office, because some conversations need to happen directly between the people they involve. Renata answered on the 4th ring. She sounded cautious, the specific caution of someone who has learned not to trust unexpected contact from people connected to a chapter of their life they're trying to leave behind. "Miss Osi," Charlie said, "my name is Charlotte Whitmore. I'm the new owner of Summit Horizon Technologies, and I'm calling you personally because I've read your grievance filing and I believe you were wronged. I'm not calling to offer you anything or to ask you anything on the record. I'm calling because I think you deserve to know that someone read what you wrote." And took it seriously, silence on the line, a long silence. Then Renata said, "You're the new owner." "Yes," another pause. "Who were you before that?" And Charlie said, "I was Daniel Carter's wife." The silence that followed that statement had a very different quality than the first one. Then Renata said very quietly, "Oh, I know," Charlie said. That's Renata stopped. Started again. "I don't quite know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it," Charlie said. "I just wanted you to know that the file wasn't buried. Someone read it, and I'm sorry it took this long for that to happen." Another pause. "Then what happens now?" "The audit is ongoing," Charlie said. "When it's complete, there will be decisions to make about the company's structure and its obligations to people who were treated unfairly. I can't make you any promises right now because I don't have the complete picture yet. But I can tell you that your grievance is part of that picture. It's being taken seriously." Renata was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was slightly different. Slightly less guarded. "I spent 8 months trying to get someone inside that company to listen. 8 months, and then I had to leave, because staying was making me into a person I didn't want to be. Angry all the time, second-guessing everything I did." "I understand that," Charlie said. "Do you?" "More than you might expect," Charlie said. "Yes," another pause. Then Renata said something that Charlie had not anticipated, in a tone that was frank and slightly sharp and completely honest. "If you were married to him, how much of this did you know about?" It was a fair question. It landed the way fair questions land when they're uncomfortable cleanly, without padding. "I didn't know what was happening inside the company," Charlie said. "I knew what was happening in my marriage. Those were 2 separate investigations, and I kept them separate on purpose." A pause. "I can see why you'd need to ask that, and I'm not offended that you did." Renata seemed to consider this. "Then what do you need from me?" "Nothing right now," Charlie said. "Just stay reachable. When the audit is complete and we're in a position to act on what we've found, I may want to talk again." "If you're willing, I'm willing," Renata said. Then after a beat, "I didn't think anyone was going to call." "I know," Charlie said. "I'm sorry it took this long." She ended the call and sat with her coffee cooling in front of her. The conversation with Marcus Webb happened 2 days later and was shorter and more formal. Marcus was a more guarded person, with the specific guardedness of someone who had been burned by a process they trusted and had rebuilt their sense of caution very deliberately afterward. He listened, he asked precise questions, he did not offer anything personal. But at the end of the call, before he hung up, he said, "The memo they sent me. About confidentiality, I kept it." "Good," Charlie said. "I kept everything," he said, and Charlie said, "So did I." It was on a Friday afternoon, 10 days into the audit, when the third vendor relationship was finally traced. Sandra called her directly. The ownership structure on the third vendor relationship, Sandra said, traces back to a holding company registered in Nevada. The ultimate beneficial owner of that holding company is. She paused, not for effect. Sandra Okafor did not do things for effect. She paused because she was reading the document carefully before she said it out loud, which was what she always did when she wanted to be certain. The ultimate beneficial owner, she said, is a woman named Patricia Whitfield. Patricia Whitfield is the registered domestic partner of Dennis Reed. Charlie went completely still. Dennis Reed, she said. Madison Reed's father, Sandra confirmed. The silence stretched. The contract value, Charlie said, total. Across 3 separate engagements over 22 months, Sand said $2.4 million. The most recent engagement was still active as of last week. Charlie set the phone down on the table for a moment. Picked it up again. Does Madison Reed know? She asked. That's not something we can determine from the financial documents, Sandra said carefully. No, Charlie said. Of course not. A pause. But Daniel does. Daniel approved every contract, Sandra said, including the 3 associated with this vendor. Including the most recent one, which was approved. A brief pause as she checked the date 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, while the divorce paperwork was already in motion. While Daniel was standing at microphones telling people his wife had never wanted more from life. 6 weeks ago, he had signed a $2.4 million contract with the father of the woman he was leaving his wife for. Charlie understood in that moment the full shape of what had been happening. Not just in her marriage, inside the company. The relationship between Daniel and Madison had not simply been a personal betrayal. It had created a financial entanglement that ran through Summit Horizon's vendor relationships, through contracts approved without proper oversight, through a compliance process that had been structured specifically to prevent the kind of scrutiny that would expose it. And 400 employees had been working inside that structure every single day, their livelihoods dependent on a company whose leadership had been treating it as a personal financial instrument. Sandra, Charlie said, I need the complete audit report. Final version, everything documented, everything sourced, everything verifiable. How long? 7 to 10 days, Sandra said, if we work weekends. Work weekends, Charlie said. I'll make sure the team is compensated accordingly. Understood, Sandra said. One more thing. Charlie waited. Daniel Carter has been asking questions, Sandra said. Not to our team directly, but we've been told through a contact in Summit Horizon's administration that he's been making inquiries about the ownership structure of the acquisition vehicle. He's trying to find out who bought the company. Charlie absorbed that. He'll find out, she said. He will, Sandra agreed. The question is when and how. I know, Charlie said. I'm working on that. She ended the call. She sat for a long time without moving. Daniel was asking questions, which meant Daniel was becoming aware that something was shifting around him, that the solid ground he had always stood on was showing cracks. He didn't know whose hands were holding the company yet. But he was starting to feel the ground move. That feeling was important. Because Charlie had spent years understanding that the most critical moment in any situation involving a person who had become accustomed to power was not the moment of confrontation. It was the moment before it. The moment when they first sensed that something had changed, when the confidence started to show hairline fractures, when the part of them that had never genuinely believed they were invulnerable began to wake up. That moment was now, and what happened next depended entirely on what Charlie decided to do with it. She thought about her mother. She thought about the kitchen table. She thought about Renata Osei saying, I spent 8 months trying to get someone to listen. She thought about Marcus Webb saying, I kept everything. She thought about 400 people, and she made her decision. Not about revenge. She had never been interested in revenge. Revenge was personal, and personal was small, and small was not what this situation called for. She was thinking about accountability, about the specific, careful, documented, irrefutable kind of accountability that couldn't be argued with or managed or smoothed over with a well-worded press release. The kind of accountability that required every piece of paper to be exactly where it was supposed to be. The kind that Sandra Okafor was very, very good at creating. She called Victoria. I need to schedule a meeting, she said. With who? Victoria asked. With Daniel, Charlie said. Private, just the two of us, no attorneys in the room. Victoria was quiet for a beat. Are you sure you want to be alone with him for this? I've been alone with him for 8 years, Charlie said. I think I can manage one more conversation. Victoria made a small sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. When the audit report is complete, Charlie said, I want to have everything in front of me before I sit across from him. I want him to understand that I know exactly what I know. And what do you want from the meeting? Charlie considered that question carefully. I want to give him the choice, she said, the real one. Not the version where he thinks he can manage the situation. The version where he understands that the situation is already managed, and the only variable left is whether he cooperates with what comes next or doesn't. And if he doesn't cooperate, Victoria asked, then the report goes to the board, Charlie said. All of it. And the board makes the decisions that boards are legally required to make when they receive documentation like this. A pause. Charlie, Victoria said, and her voice shifted slightly, the specific shift that meant she was about to say something she'd been holding back. I need you to understand something. When this becomes public, and it will become public, the story is going to be very complicated. People are going to have opinions about your role, about why you were in the marriage, about whether you knew things you've said you didn't know, about your motivations. It's going to be messy, Charlie said. Very messy, Victoria said. I know, Charlie said. I've known that since October, since the ring hit the floor. Since she walked out of that ballroom, since she sat in her car and called Victoria and said, tell me how healthy the company really is. She had always known this was going to get complicated before it got clean. I'm not doing this because it's easy, Charlie said. I'm doing it because it's right, and those two things have never been the same. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then I know. I've known that about you since the first week we worked together. Then you know I'm not going to stop, Charlie said. I know, Victoria said. That's what I'm counting on. They said goodnight. Charlie closed her laptop. She sat at the kitchen table in the house she had shared with Daniel for 6 years, the table that had witnessed more of her real self than any other surface in her life, and she let the silence of the house settle around her. It was quiet. It had been quiet in this house for longer than Daniel leaving. This particular quiet had been growing for years, filling in the spaces between them, finding its way into conversations and dinners and mornings and all the small ordinary moments that are supposed to hold a marriage together but had, in their case, been holding apart something that had already come undone. She was not afraid of what was coming. She had been afraid of things in her life. She was honest enough with herself to know that, but this was not fear. This was the specific feeling that comes when you have done the preparation, when you have done the work, when you know exactly what you're carrying and where you're going and why, and all that remains is the walking. She had walked into rooms before that others thought would stop her. She had pitched investors who didn't believe her. She had signed contracts in languages she was still learning. She had built something real out of nothing but a kitchen table, and her mother's voice in her head, and the absolute refusal to let anyone else decide what she was worth. She could walk into one more room. She could sit across from Daniel Carter one more time. And she could show him calmly, completely, without raising her voice, exactly who he had always been sitting across from. The audit report would be ready in 10 days. She could wait 10 days. She had waited 8 years. 10 days was nothing. The audit report arrived on a Tuesday morning, 9 days after Sandra had promised 10. Charlie was already awake when her phone lit up with Sandra's message at 6:42. She had been awake since 5, which had become her pattern over the past 2 weeks, the kind of early waking that isn't insomnia exactly, but the body's way of telling you that your mind has already started the day without you, and you might as well catch up. She read the message once, then she called Sandra directly. It's complete, she said. Complete, sourced, and verified, Sandra said. Every number has a corresponding document, every name has a corresponding record. The forensic accounting associate finished tracing the third vendor relationship last night. It's all there. How bad is the total picture? Sandra paused for exactly 1 second. The documented financial irregularities total approximately $4.1 million across all identified vendor relationships. That's the conservative number, the one I'm prepared to stand behind in any legal proceeding. The actual figure may be higher, but what I can prove is $4.1 million. Charlie let that number sit in the air for a moment. And the employment actions, she said, the grievances, the promotions, the people who were pushed out. All documented, Sandra said. 7 employees passed over for promotions they were formally recommended for. 2 grievances filed and closed without resolution. 1 employee, Renata Osi, who we've been able to connect through a timeline of documented events to what appears to be a retaliatory reassignment 3 weeks before her resignation. Though proving intent on that piece will require more work, a pause. Marcus Webb's situation is cleaner. The confidentiality memo sent to him 3 days after he raised concerns about vendor relationships is documented, and the timing is, in my professional opinion, not coincidental. No, Charlie said, it isn't. The report is in your document system, Sandra said. 114 pages, appendices included. Charlie thanked her. She said it, the way she always said thank you to people who had done genuinely difficult work well directly, without elaboration, because elaboration dilutes sincerity. She opened her laptop. She read the report from page 1. She read it completely, carefully, without skipping sections. She read the appendices. She cross-referenced 3 things that caught her attention and found that in each case, Sanford's was exact, and her conclusions were conservative, which meant that, if anything, the documented picture was more restrained than the reality it was describing. It took her 2 hours and 40 minutes. When she finished, she closed the laptop, sat back in her chair, and breathed. Then she called Victoria. I've read the report, she said. And Victoria said, schedule the meeting with Daniel, Charlie said. End of this week, Thursday if he's available, Friday if he isn't. Private neutral location, not Summit Horizon, not our house. The Meridian Club has private conference rooms. Book one of those. I'll contact his assistant, Victoria said. Don't go through his assistant, Charlie said. Call him directly, his personal cell. A pause. You want me to call his personal cell? Yes, Charlie said. He needs to understand from the first contact that this is different from anything he's managed before. If the call comes through his assistant, he'll have time to prepare a version of himself before he picks up. I don't want him to have that time. Victoria was quiet for a moment. You've thought about this carefully. I've thought about almost nothing else for 2 weeks, Charlie said. Victoria called Daniel Carter's personal cell at 9:15 that morning. He answered on the second ring, which told Charlie when Victoria reported back that he had been expecting contact. That he had been on alert for it, Mr. Carter, Victoria said. My name is Victoria Lawson. I'm calling on behalf of the ownership group that recently acquired Summit Horizon Technologies. The new owner would like to meet with you privately this Thursday. 2 o'clock, the Meridian Club private conference suite on the 4th floor. A pause on the line. Who is the owner? Daniel said. The owner will identify herself at the meeting, Victoria said. Another pause, longer herself, Daniel repeated. Thursday at 2, Victoria said. Please confirm your availability. A beat. I'll be there, Daniel said. He said it the way a man says something when he's trying to sound more confident than he feels. Victoria recognized it immediately. She called Charlie right after. He said herself, Victoria told her, and then he went quiet. How long was the quiet? Charlie asked. 4 seconds, Victoria said. Maybe 5. Charlie nodded to herself. He's starting to understand. Does that concern you? No, Charlie said. A man who knows what's coming and still can't stop it is in a much more honest situation than a man walking in blind. I'd rather face someone who has had a few days to consider his position. It means he's already done the internal accounting. He already knows what the numbers look like. Victoria made a soft sound of agreement. What do you need between now and Thursday? I need the 4-page executive summary Sandra can pull from the report, Charlie said. Plain language, no legal jargon. I want Daniel to be able to read it and understand every word without an attorney translating it for him. And I need 2 copies of the full report in physical binders. A pause. 1 for the meeting, 1 for the board when it goes to the board. If it goes to the board, Victoria said carefully. When, Charlie said. The difference is only whether Daniel is cooperative or not. Either way, this goes to the board. The question is whether he's standing beside me when it does or standing across from me. Thursday arrived the way important days always arrived, for Charlie quietly, without ceremony, looking from the outside like any other morning. She woke at 5 again. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table for 40 minutes without opening her laptop, which was her version of stillness, her version of the thing other people called meditation. She thought about her mother. She thought about Elizabeth Whitmore sitting at a different kitchen table, on a night 30-something years ago, making a list after the man who was supposed to stay had decided to go. Not collapsing, calculating, finding the door before the fire started. She thought about what her mother would say if she could see this morning. If she could see where that kitchen table had led. If she could see the woman her daughter had become, not despite the years of hiding, but partly because of them. Because patience was not the same as passivity, because choosing not to be seen was not the same as having nothing to show. She got dressed without consulting anyone about what to wear. She chose a charcoal blazer she had owned for 4 years, well-fitted and unshowy, and dark trousers, and shoes that were practical and serious. She did not dress to impress Daniel Carter. She dressed the way she always dressed for important work, in a way that communicated, without announcing it, that she was there to do something real. She arrived at the Meridian Club at 1:45. She asked for coffee. She sat in the private conference room with the audit report binder on the table, and in front of her 4-page executive summary on top, and she waited. Daniel arrived at 1:58. She heard his footsteps in the hallway before the door opened his particular walk, the one she had heard every day for 8 years, the confident, slightly heavy stride of a man who had never quite learned to move through the world without announcing himself. The door opened. He stepped in, he saw her, and for exactly 3 seconds Daniel Carter's face did something she had never seen it do before. It went completely blank, not surprised, not angry. Not calculating, blank. The way a fake goes blank when the brain receives information it genuinely did not have a category for. Information that requires a hard reset before any other reaction can form. Then the mask came back, slower than usual and not quite fitting the same way it always had, but it came back. Charlie, he said. Daniel, she said, please sit down. He looked at the chair across from her. He looked at the binder on the table. He looked at her face. He sat down. For a moment neither of them spoke. It was Daniel who broke first, which she had expected. He had never been able to tolerate silence between them. She had understood this about him. Within the first year of their marriage, that silence made him anxious, that he filled it the way some people fill empty spaces in a room, reflexively, without thinking about whether the fill was necessary. You bought my company, he said. Yes, she said. How long have you? He stopped. Started again. How long have you been able to do something like that? A while, she said. He looked at her with an expression that was trying to be several things simultaneously, bewildered, controlled, calculating, and not quite succeeding at any of them. The online business, the thing you always said, was small. I understated it, she said. He let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. You understated it. He shook his head slowly. Charlie, that's an extraordinary understatement. I know, she said. I made it deliberately. I wanted to know if you loved me or my money. I wanted the relationship to be real. A pause. For a while it was. Something crossed his face at that something genuine, something that didn't belong to the controlled version of himself he was trying to maintain. It was there for only a moment, and then it was gone, but she saw it. In 8 years of marriage, she had learned to read the flickers. She did not pursue it, she moved instead. I asked you here because I want to talk about Summit Horizon, she said. Not our marriage. That conversation is already over and I think we both know it. This conversation is about the company. She opened the binder and turned the executive summary toward him. I'd like you to read the first 4 pages, she said. Take whatever time you need. Daniel looked at the papers. He picked them up, and as he read, as his eyes moved down the first page, and then the second, and then slowed on the third, she watched his face change in the specific, incremental way that faces change when they encounter information that confirms something the reader has been hoping was not true. By the 4th page, his jaw was set in a way she recognized. He set the papers down. Who prepared this? He said. Sandra Okafor, she said, 22 years in forensic financial review. The sourcing is documented in full in the binder. Every number has a corresponding record. He was quiet. Horizon Bridge Partners, she said. Trevor's company. Trevor provided legitimate services, Daniel said immediately. Too immediately. The response was already assembled, which meant he had assembled it some time ago, which meant he had known this conversation was coming in some form, some version, at some point. The 3rd engagement, Charlie said, $1.2 million. No specified deliverables in the contract language. Strategic advisory services don't always produce tangible deliverables on a defined schedule. Daniel, she said. He stopped. She kept her voice level. Not cold, not angry, level, the way Sandra kept her voice level when she was about to say something that didn't need emotional amplification to be devastating. There is no work product associated with the engagement, she said. No emails, no reports, no presentations, no record of any advice received or acted upon. The folder contains the contract, the invoices, and a restaurant receipt. He looked at the table. The 3rd vendor relationship, she said, traces to Patricia Whitfield. Dennis Reed's domestic partner. She paused. Madison Reed's father. The silence that followed was different from any silence that had passed between them in 8 years of marriage. It was the silence of someone who has run out of the particular kind of room that confidence gives you when you're accustomed to walking through walls. Daniel, she said, and her voice was quieter now, not softer exactly, but quieter, because what she was about to say was not meant to wound him further, it was meant to give him the one actual choice he had left. I'm not here to destroy you. I want you to understand that. I have never wanted to destroy you, not after the ballroom. Not after reading this report. That is not what this is. He looked up at her. What I am here to tell you, she said, is that this report goes to the board. That is not a threat, and it is not negotiable. It's a legal obligation that I have as the owner of this company, and I intend to fulfill it. 400 people work at Summit Horizon. They deserve leadership that is accountable. They deserve a company that is run honestly, specifically deserve more than what they received. She paused. What I am offering you is a choice about how you participate in what comes next. He stared at her. You could cooperate fully, she said. With the board process, with the independent review, with whatever remediation is required. You could choose to handle this with the kind of transparency that might preserve some portion of your professional reputation. Or you could fight it. You could hire attorneys and issue statements and try to manage the narrative. And you would lose, not because I'm powerful enough to guarantee it, but because Sandra Okafor's work is bulletproof and the documents are real, and the people who were wronged are willing to talk. She let that land. Then she said, I'm giving you this conversation privately because despite everything, I spent 8 years married to you, and I am not a cruel person. But I need you to understand that my patience for this particular courtesy is finite. I am meeting with the board in 8 days. What you decide between now and then is the only variable you control. Daniel was very still. She had expected anger. She had prepared for it, had a calm response ready for whatever version of it he chose to deploy, the cold, controlled kind, the explosive kind, the kind that blames everything on the person delivering the news. Because blaming the messenger is the last refuge of someone who cannot face the message. What she had not expected was what actually happened. He put his elbows on the table and pressed his hands against his face. And for a moment, just a moment, he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had made a series of choices that had compounded in a direction he hadn't been paying attention to, Because paying attention had never been necessary before. Because there had always been another room to walk into, and another audience to charm, and another version of the story to tell. She watched him. She did not feel triumph. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. What she felt was something more complex and less satisfying than triumph. Something closer to the feeling you get when a storm you've been watching build finally arrives, and the relief of the arrival is mixed with the weight of knowing the cleanup hasn't started yet. He lowered his hands, he looked at her, and what came out of his mouth was not an apology. She had not expected an apology, but it also wasn't the attack she had braced for. He said, "Did you know? Before we got married, did you already know what you were worth and decide not to tell me?" It was the most honest question he had asked her in years. "Yes," she said, "I knew." He said, "Why would you do that?" "Because I wanted to be loved for who I was," she said. "Not what I had." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "And were you for a while?" She didn't answer immediately, because the honest answer was complicated, and she had promised herself she would be honest, even now, even here, even with someone who had stood at a microphone and called her ordinary in front of 400 people. "Yes," she said finally, "for a while, yes," he nodded. He looked at the binder. He looked at the executive summary. He said, "Trevor needed the contracts. He was in a bad place financially, and he stopped." "That's not an excuse." "No," Charlie said, "it isn't." "I knew the process wasn't." He stopped again. "I knew." "I know you knew," she said. "The read contract," he said. "That one, Charlie, I need you to understand that Madison didn't ask for that." She didn't know about it. Charlie looked at him carefully. "Does that matter legally?" "A beat." "No," he said. "I suppose it doesn't, but it matters to you," she said. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She closed the binder. 8 days, she said. "If you want to talk to your attorney before you decide anything, do that. If you want to cooperate with the board process, have your attorney contact Victoria Lawson before Friday of next week. If I don't hear from your attorney by Friday, I proceed without your cooperation, and the board receives the full report with no prior discussion with you." She stood. He stayed seated. She picked up the binder. "Charlie," he said. She looked at him. He seemed to be searching for something, some word, some arrangement of words that would be adequate to the situation, that would begin to address the gap between what had happened and what should have happened, and what he wished had happened. His face moved through several things in quick succession. Finally, he said, "I'm sorry, for the ballroom." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. She walked to the door. She did not look back. In the hallway outside the conference room, she allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of absolute stillness. Eyes forward, both hands at her sides, breathing, then she walked to the elevator. She called Victoria from the car. "How did it go?" Victoria asked. "He'll cooperate," Charlie said. "You're certain?" 80%, she said. "He's not a stupid man. He's a man who stopped paying attention to certain things, because paying attention felt like an obstacle to the version of himself he was trying to be. But he's not stupid. He understands what the documents mean." "And the other 20%? Pride," Charlie said. "It's always pride with people like Daniel. Sometimes it overrides everything else, including self-interest. If it does in this case, we proceed to the board without him, and the outcome is the same, just slower and louder. And more damaging to him personally," Victoria said. "Yes," Charlie said, "but that's his choice to make." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "How are you?" It was a simple question. Victoria asked it the way she had asked it for 12 years directly, without preamble, the way you ask it when you want to either and don't have time for a polished version of it. "I'm clear," Charlie said. "That's different from fine," Victoria observed. "It is," Charlie agreed. "Fine is about how you feel. Clear is about where you're going." A pause. "Patricia Ellison called this morning," Victoria said. "She saw the trade reports about the acquisition. She wants to know if you need anything." Patricia Ellison, the woman who had funded Aurelia 12 years ago when 21 other investors said no. The woman who had read Charlie's business plan in one sitting and told her to fix the rural hospital revenue modeling and come back. The woman who had sat across from her at a kitchen table in San Francisco and said, with the particular certainty of someone who has been right about these things before, "You're going to build something important." "I want to be part of it. Tell her I'll call her this weekend," Charlie said. "I want to talk to her before the board meeting. I'll let her know," Victoria said. Charlie drove. The city moved around her in its ordinary way: traffic lights, other cars, the particular gray-bright quality of a Seattle afternoon, and she moved through it, feeling the specific weight of a day that has changed something real. A day that has moved something that needed to be moved. She was thinking about the board meeting. She was thinking about what came after. She was thinking about Renata Osi, who had spent 8 months trying to get someone inside Summit Horizon to listen, and who had not yet been told what Charlie was about to do on her behalf. She was thinking about Marcus Webb, who had kept everything. She was thinking about 400 people who were going to walk into Summit Horizon on Monday morning, and the Monday after that, and all the Mondays that followed, and who deserved to walk into something that was actually what it claimed to be. She stopped at a red light. Her phone buzzed, an unknown number. She answered. Miss Whitmore, a woman's voice, controlled, careful. "My name is Madison Reed." Charlie was very still. "Ms. Reed," she said, a pause. "I'm sorry to call you directly. I got your number from it. Doesn't matter how I got it. I needed to talk to you before whatever happens next." "I need you to know something." "I'm listening," Charlie said. "My father's contracts with Summit Horizon," Madison said. "I found out 3 days ago. I didn't know. I want you to understand that I didn't know." Charlie listened to the steadiness in Madison's voice and heard, underneath it, the specific strain of someone who is working very hard to keep their voice steady, because if they stop working at it, it won't be. "Daniel never told me," Madison said, "about the vendor relationship. About Patricia, my father's partner, being involved. I found out because I started asking questions after the acquisition was announced. I pulled the vendor records myself." Her voice caught slightly. "I found my father's name." "What did you do when you found it?" Charlie said. A pause. "I called my father," Madison said, "and I asked him if it was true." "What did he say?" "He said Daniel had approached him," Madison said. "Not the other way around. That Daniel had structured the arrangement without telling me because he didn't want me to feel she stopped. Because he didn't want it to affect my position at the company. Or my feelings about the relationship." Charlie absorbed that. "Miss Reed," she said carefully, "why are you telling me this?" A long pause. "Because I think you deserve to know," Madison said. "And because I think," another pause, longer, "because I think I made assumptions about you that were wrong. Daniel used to talk about you in a way that made it seem like you were." She stopped. Started again. "He made it seem like the problem in the marriage was you. That you were content being small, that you didn't have ambition. That he had outgrown the relationship." Her voice was very controlled now. "Careful, and I believed him, because it was easier to believe him than to ask harder questions." The light had long since changed. Charlie had pulled to the side of the road without quite being aware of doing it. "I'm not asking you to absolve me," Madison said. "I know my role in all of this. I wanted you to hear from me directly that the contracts were not something I was part of. And I wanted to say I'm sorry for the part I did play. For the assumption I made about who you were." Silence. Charlie sat with it. Then she said, "I appreciate you calling Ms. Reed. I want to be honest with you. The board process will examine everything, including the circumstances of your promotions and the pace at which they happened. That's not something I can protect you from. It's a process that needs to be complete and honest." "I know," Madison said. "I'm not asking you to protect me." "What are you asking?" Charlie said. A pause. "I'm asking you to believe that I didn't know," Madison said. "That's all." Charlie thought about that. "I believe you," she said. And she did, not because it made Madison blameless. Not because it resolved everything, but because the call itself, the act of making it, the specific quality of what Madison had said, and how she had said it told Charlie something real about the person on the other end of the line. And Charlie had spent enough years reading people to trust what she read. "Thank you," Madison said. The line went quiet. Charlie set the phone down on the passenger seat. She sat for a moment in the particular silence of a day that has given you more than you expected to receive. Then she pulled back into traffic. She had 8 days until the board meeting. She had a report that was 114 pages long and bulletproof. She had 2 people whose names were in that report who deserved to know what was coming. She had a company with 400 employees who were about to find out who really owned it. And she had one last thing to do before any of that one conversation she had been saving. The way you save certain things for when you actually need them, when the weight of what you're carrying finally requires the specific kind of ballast that only one person can provide. She needed to call her mother. Elizabeth Whitmore answered on the second ring the way she always had, because Elizabeth Whitmore believed that letting a phone ring more than twice communicated a kind of carelessness that she did not associate with herself. "Charlie," she said. "Hi, Mom," Charlie said, a pause. The particular pause of a mother reading a daughter's voice for things that aren't in the words. "How are you?" Elizabeth said. "Clear," Charlie said. A beat, then Elizabeth said, "Tell me," and Charlie drove and told her everything. Elizabeth Whitmore had listened to the whole thing without interrupting once. That was something people who didn't know her well consistently underestimated about her capacity for complete, undivided silence when someone she loved was speaking. Most people listened the way they drove in heavy traffic, half attending, one eye always on what was coming next. Elizabeth listened the way she had worked as a nurse for 31 years, with her entire attention on the person in front of her, because she had learned long ago that the thing people said was rarely the only thing that needed to be heard. When Charlie finished, there was a long pause on the line. Then Elizabeth said, 4.1 million, conservative estimate, Charlie said. And he signed every contract himself, everyone. Another pause. "Are you angry?" Elizabeth asked. Charlie considered the question honestly, the way her mother's questions always required you to consider them not as rhetorical volleys, but as actual inquiries that deserved actual answers. "Not the way I expected to be," she said. "When I first read the report, I thought I'd feel more. More heat, more of that specific kind of anger that makes you want to say things you'll regret. But it wasn't like that." She paused. "It felt more like clarity. Like finally being able to see the shape of something that had been in the room for a long time without a clear outline." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. "Then that's maturity, Charlie. That's not weakness. Some people would mistake those two things." "I know," Charlie said. "I'm not mistaking them. What happens next?" "Board meeting in 8 days," Charlie said. "The report goes to every board member in advance. Sandra presents the findings. I make the case for structural remediation." And then she paused, and then the board does what boards are legally required to do. "And Daniel? His attorney contacted Victoria this morning," Charlie said. "He's going to cooperate." Elizabeth absorbed that. "I'm surprised," she said. "He always seemed like a man who would fight." "He is," Charlie said, "but even fighters read the room eventually." He read it. Her mother made a soft sound, not quite approval, not quite relief. "Something in between. I'm proud of you," Elizabeth said. Charlie felt that land the way her mother's words had always landed, not gently, but truly, which was different. Her mother did not say things she didn't mean. She had never been the kind of parent who scattered praise the way some people scattered breadcrumbs, casually and without intent. When Elizabeth Whitmore said she was proud of you, she meant it with her whole chest. "I know, Mom," Charlie said. "I know." She drove home. She slept for the first time in weeks, completely through the night. The next 7 days were the most operationally intense of Charlie's professional life, which was saying something, because her professional life had contained a number of days that would have flattened most people. Victoria coordinated the board communication. Sandra prepared her presentation materials. The full report, all 114 pages, appendices included, was delivered to each of Summit Horizon's 7 board members via secure document system on a Monday morning. The cover letter from Charlie, that was 3 paragraphs long, clearly written and said exactly what it needed to say without a word of excess. The board members' responses varied, in the way that responses always vary when powerful policy receiving race requires them to reckon with something they probably should have been paying close attention to. 2 of them called Victoria within hours of receiving the report, asking detailed procedural questions. What was the timeline? What was the remediation framework? What was the ownership group's position on executive transition? These were the board members Charlie was not worried about. People who ask procedural questions in the first hours were people processing toward action. 2 others waited 24 hours and then sent written responses through their own counsel, formal, carefully worded, neither cooperative nor obstructive. These were the ones who were consulting their own exposure before deciding which direction to move in. Charlie had expected this. She had prepared for it. One board member, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had been on Summit Horizon's board since the company's early days and who had, according to Sandra's research, approved 2 of the most problematic vendor contracts during a period when Daniel had been particularly focused on expanding his influence over the board's approval process, called Charlie directly. She answered. "Ms. Whitmore," he said. His voice was the voice of a man who was trying to project confidence over a foundation that had just developed a significant crack. "I've read the report." "Good," Charlie said. "I want you to understand that the board's oversight process." "Mr. Fitch," she said, cutting across him cleanly, without heat, the way you cut through something that needs to be cut. "The report documents what happened. I'm not interested in a conversation about the oversight process right now. I'm interested in what you intend to do with what you've read." A pause. "I intend to be present at the board meeting," he said carefully. "I expect nothing less," she said. She ended the call. The remaining 2 board members contacted her directly within 48 hours, both expressing clear and unequivocal support for the remediation process, both asking whether Charlie intended to maintain the company's current operational structure through the transition. These were the ones she had been quietly most interested in from the beginning. One of them, a woman named Dr. Anita Brewer, who sat on 3 other corporate boards and had a reputation for institutional integrity that was unambiguous, had already sent her a private note that said simply, "Long overdue." "Well done." Charlie had read that note twice. She had not replied immediately. She had thought about it for a day, and then she had called Dr. Brewer directly, and they had talked for 45 minutes about what Summit Horizon could become, with the right structure and the right accountability systems, and it was the most energizing conversation Charlie had had since the acquisition closed. By Thursday evening, 5 days before the board meeting, Daniel's attorney had submitted a complete cooperation agreement through Victoria. Daniel would provide full documentation supporting the audit findings. He would not contest the board's remediation recommendations. He would resign his position as CEO upon request, with a statement acknowledging operational deficiencies under his leadership. He would cooperate with any independent compliance review process the board instituted. In exchange, the ownership group would not pursue personal civil litigation against him for the financial irregularities, provided full remediation was completed by the company. The vendor contracts would be unwound. The funds would be recovered where recoverable. Victoria read Charlie the agreement in full over the phone. When she finished, she said, "It's cleaner than I expected." "His attorney is good," Charlie said. "His attorney knows the difference between a client who has leverage and a client who doesn't," Victoria said. "Yes," Charlie said, "so does Daniel now." Signed the cooperation agreement the next morning. She did not feel triumphant about it. She felt the particular satisfaction of a process that was moving the way a well-designed process moves, with friction where friction was appropriate and momentum where momentum was earned. On Friday, 4 days before the board meeting, she called Renata O.C. Renata answered quickly. "Ms. Whitmore," she said. Charlie said. "Please," a small pause. "Charlie." I wanted to call before the board meeting because you deserve to know what's happening before it becomes public, Charlie said. The audit is complete, the findings are documented and verified. The board has received the full report, the vendor irregularities, the employment actions, your grievance, and Marcus Webb's. All of it is in the record. All of it will be addressed in the remediation process. Silence on Renata's end, a long silence. Then what does addressed mean? It means the board will institute an independent review of all employment actions taken during the period in question, Charlie said. It means the people who were passed over for promotions they were recommended for will have those decisions formally reviewed and, where the evidence supports it, remediated. For some people that will mean reinstatement offers. For others, where reinstatement isn't practical or desired, it will mean financial remediation. Will I have to fight for it? Renata said. Her voice was steady, but Charlie heard the weariness is underneath it, the specific weariness of someone who had already fought once and lost, and was not sure they had the same amount left to spend on a second round. No, Charlie said, you won't have to fight. Your grievance is in the record. The evidence is in the record. The process will come to you. Another pause. Why are you doing this? Renata said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. Because you tried to do the right thing through the right channels, Charlie said. And the right channels failed you. That's not a reason to walk away, it's a reason to fix the channels. Renata was quiet for a moment, then she said, you know what I remember most? Not the promotion being denied. I could live with that. What I couldn't live with was the ways the grievance was handled. They closed it in 4 days, and the letter they sent me said they'd done a thorough review. She made a short, humorless sound. 4 days is not a thorough review, no, Charlie said. It isn't. It was a signal, Renata said. It was them telling me, you don't matter enough to take seriously. I know, Charlie said, and I'm sorry, and I want you to know that this time you do. Another pause, this one different from the others. This one the pause of someone receiving something they had stopped expecting. Thank you, Renata said finally. Thank you for answering the first call, Charlie said. Not everyone would have. She called Marcus Webb 20 minutes later. He was characteristically more contained than Renata. He asked specific questions about the legal framework of the remediation process, about timelines, about what the cooperation agreement meant for the company's obligations to former employees. He asked whether the documents he had retained, the confidentiality memo, the emails preceding it, the internal communications he had carefully saved would be needed. They're already in the record, Charlie said. Sandra's team found the parallel documentation through the company's own systems. But if you have additional materials that corroborate the timeline, yes. We may want them. I'll make them available, he said. Marcus, she said, a pause. He was not accustomed to her using his first name, and she heard the slight shift in his attention. You spent 8 years at that company, she said. You raised a concern through the proper process, and you were sent a memo reminding you to be quiet. And you kept everything anyway. That took more courage than most people would have used. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know if it was courage, he said. I think it was just I needed to know I had told the truth. Even if nobody believed me at the time, I needed to know that the record existed somewhere. It exists, Charlie said. It's in the report, 114 pages. She heard him exhale. Okay, he said. Okay, thank you. She ended the call and sat for a moment in the specific quiet of someone who has said what needed to be said and does not need to add anything to it. The board meeting was set for Monday at 10 in the morning. Summit Horizon's conference facility on the 14th floor, a room Charlie had never personally been in, though she had heard Daniel describe it more than once as the place where decisions got made. She arrived at 9:45. Sandra was already there, setting up her presentation materials with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this before and understood that the first impression a room receives of your preparation communicates something important about the credibility of everything that follows. Victoria arrived at 9:50. The board members filtered twin to 9:50 and 10 exactly. Dr. Anita Brewer arrived first and gave Charlie a handshake that communicated clearly and without any unnecessary dramatics that she was fully prepared to do whatever the situation required. Gerald Fitch arrived last at 9:59 and sat at the far end of the table with the expression of a man who had spent the preceding week making his peace with something uncomfortable. At 10 o'clock, Charlie stood. She did not look at her notes. She had not written notes because she did not need them. She knew the report, she knew the numbers, she knew the names. She knew the stories, Renata's 8 months of trying to get someone to listen, Marcus's 3 days between raising a concern and receiving a silence memo, the 14-month pattern of promotions and vendor contracts that had operated just below the threshold of what anyone looking casually would think to question. She knew all of it, and she spoke it not as a prosecution, not as a victory speech. She spoke it the way her mother had always modeled, speaking difficult truth directly, without embellishment, with full respect for the weight of what was being said and complete trust that the weight itself was sufficient. She spoke for 42 minutes. Sandra presented for 28 more. Then the room was open for questions. Gerald Fitch asked 3. All 3 were procedural. All 3 were the questions of a man trying to understand his own exposure without quite asking that question directly. Charlie answered each one fully and without sarcasm, because the situation did not require sarcasm and she was not going to introduce it. Dr. Brewer asked one question that was not procedural at all. She looked at Charlie and said, "What does this company look like when this process is complete? What's your vision for what Summit Horizon becomes?" Charlie looked at her. It was the question she had been waiting for. Not because it was the most important question, legally it wasn't, but because it was the question that separated what this meeting was from what people might assume it was. This meeting was not about punishment. It was about what came after. Summit Horizon has real assets, Charlie said. Real technology, real talent, real market position. The problems we've documented are problems of leadership and governance. They're not structural failures of the business itself. What I want Summit Horizon to become is a company that the people who work here deserve. A company where your promotion depends on your performance, not your access. A company where if you raise a concern through the proper channel, it is taken seriously and answered honestly. A company where the numbers mean what they say they mean. She paused. That's not a complicated vision, but it requires building the right systems and putting the right people in the right roles, and being willing to hold the company accountable to its own stated standards. Dr. Brewer nodded slowly. "And you intend to be personally involved in that process?" "Yes," Charlie said, "I do." The board voted at 12:47. Daniel's resignation as CEO was accepted unanimously. The independent compliance review was authorized unanimously. The remediation framework for affected employees was approved 6-1. Gerald Fitch casting the single dissenting vote, which surprised no one, including Charlie. An interim CEO would be appointed within 2 weeks while a proper search process was conducted. When the vote was complete and the formal proceedings were closed, Dr. Brewer walked across the room to where Charlie was standing and shook her hand again. "I've been on this board for 3 years, she said quietly. I always felt like something was slightly off, not enough to put my finger on. Just slightly off. She looked at Charlie carefully. "I'm sorry it took this long. It took as long as it took," Charlie said. "What matters is what happens from here." Dr. Brewer smiled, a genuine, unperformed smile, the kind that reaches the eyes. "You're going to be a remarkable presence in this company." "I intend to be," Charlie said. The room cleared gradually. Sandra packed her materials. Victoria organized the documentation. Board members made their way to the elevator in 1s and 2s, stopping to check their phones and schedule follow-up calls and do all the things that people do after a significant meeting has shifted the landscape of something they're responsible for. Gerald Fitch stopped near the door on his way out. He looked at Charlie. He said, "I want you to know I wasn't part of the approval process for those contracts intentionally. I should have asked more questions. I didn't." He paused. "I'm saying that to you because you deserve to hear it from me directly. Not to ask for anything, Charlie looked at him. Thank you, she said. That matters. He nodded once and left. When the room was empty except for Charlie and Victoria, Victoria sat down in one of the vacated board chairs and looked at Charlie with an expression that was somewhere between exhaustion and satisfaction, the specific look of someone who has carried something heavy for a very long distance and has finally set it down in the right place. That went well, Victoria said. It went the way it should have gone, Charlie said. Those are sometimes the same thing, Victoria said. Charlie picked up the copy of the report, her copy, the one she had carried into the room and would carry back out, and held it for a moment. She was thinking about what came next, not in an anxious way. In the specific way that she had always thought about next steps practically, with full attention, with the understanding that the period immediately after asks a significant resolution was often the most important period operationally, because it was the period when people defaulted to old habits if you let them, when the momentum of change needed to be actively maintained rather than assumed. The remediation process had to be real, not performative. Not the corporate version of an apology that acknowledged wrongdoing in principle and changed nothing in practice. Renata Ossi's situation had to be addressed with specific documented action. Marcus Webb's situation had to be addressed with specific documented action. The 7 employees who had been passed over needed to receive formal reviews from an independent evaluator with no connection to the prior leadership structure. The vendor contracts needed to be formally unwound, and the recovery process needed to be transparent not just to the board, but to the company's employees, who deserved to know that the culture they worked inside was being honestly addressed. And Summit Horizon needed new leadership, not just interim leadership. Real, permanent, accountable leadership from someone who understood what this company was supposed to be and was willing to build it that way. Charlie had been thinking about who that might be. She had a name in mind. She had not said it to anyone yet. She wanted to make one more call before she did. She waited until Victoria had gathered her things and they had ridden the elevator down together and parted ways in the lobby, Victoria back to Aurelia's offices, Charlie to her car. She drove to the small coffee shop 3 blocks away. She ordered tea, not coffee. She sat at a corner table with her phone and her copy of the report, and she made the call she had been thinking about for 3 days. The phone rang twice. Charlie, Patricia Ellison said. She sounded alert, the way Patricia Ellison always sounded, present and slightly ahead of the conversation. The board meeting was this morning, Charlie said. I know, Patricia said. Victoria texted me. How did it go? The way it should have, Charlie said. Good, a pause. And now I need to build the company, Charlie said. Which is the harder part. It always is, Patricia said. The acquiring part gets all the drama. The building part is where the actual work lives. I know, Charlie said. I wanted to ask you something. Ask, Patricia said. The interim CEO appointment, the board is giving me the lead on that. I want someone with clean hands and operational credibility and no prior connection to Summit Horizon's old culture. Someone who can walk in on day one and be completely credible to 400 people who have just watched everything they thought was stable get turned inside out. That's a specific profile, Patricia said. I have a specific candidate, Charlie said. But I want your read before I move forward. A pause. Who's Sandra Okafor, Charlie said, a longer pause. Your forensic auditor, Patricia said. The person who documented everything, knows the company's structure better than anyone alive right now except me, has zero personal history with any of the prior leadership, and has a reputation for integrity that is completely unimpeachable, Charlie said. She's also, when you talk to her beyond the forensic reports, an extraordinarily clear operational thinker. She knows how processes should work because she spends her career documenting what happens when they don't. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Have you asked her? Patricia said. Not yet, Charlie said. I wanted your read first. Patricia made a sound that was almost a laugh. Charlie. In 12 years of working with you, you have almost never been wrong about people. The 3 times you've been wrong, you knew you were taking a risk when you made the call and you told me so in advance. A pause. Are you telling me this is a risk? No, Charlie said. I'm telling you this is right, then call her, Patricia said. Charlie smiled. She ended the call. She looked at the tea cooling in front of her. She looked at the report on the table beside it, 114 pages. Sandra's name was on the cover as lead auditor. She picked up her phone again. Sandra answered on the first ring. The board meeting went well, Charlie said. All resolutions passed. The remediation framework is authorized. Good, Sandra said. She said it's the way Sandra said most things cleanly, without embellishment, the tone of someone who expected competent people to do competent things and was not surprised when they did. I want to ask you something, Charlie said. And I want you to know before I ask it that there's no correct answer, and I'm genuinely prepared to, and saying no will not change anything about our professional relationship or my regard for the work you've done. A pause. That's an interesting preamble, Sandra said. I want to offer you the interim CEO position at Summit Horizon, Charlie said. Silence, not a short silence, a real one. Sandra Okafor did not do things for effect. So when she was quiet for 9 full seconds, Charlie understood that the silence was the thing working. That's not what I expected you to say, Sandra said finally. I know, Charlie said. I'm saying it anyway. Another pause. I'm an auditor, Sandra said. You're a person who understands exactly how organizations fail and exactly what it takes to prevent those failures from recurring, Charlie said. You know Summit Horizon's structure better than anyone. You have complete credibility with the board. You have no prior relationship with any of the people or systems that created these problems. And you are one of the most operationally clear thinkers I've encountered in 20 years of working with talented people. Sandra was quiet again. It would be interim, she said slowly. While the permanent search is conducted, yes, Charlie said, with the option to be considered for the permanent role if that's something you wanted to pursue. I've never run a company, Sandra said. You've spent 22 years showing companies where they went wrong, Charlie said. That's a more complete education than most CEOs receive. A long pause, then Sandra said, I'd need to bring James. Charlie felt something loosen in her chest, the specific loosening of a decision that has been made and is now moving. Of course, she said, and I'd need full transparency with the board, Sandra said. No decisions made around me, everything documented. Everything documented, Charlie confirmed. I wouldn't have it any other way. Another pause. Give me 24 hours, Sandra said. Take 48, Charlie said. This is not a decision to make in a hurry. 24 is enough, Sandra said. I already know what I'm going to say. I just need to sit with it for a day and make sure I know it for the right reasons. That was, Charlie thought, one of the most honest things anyone had said to her in the entire course of this extraordinary month. Call me tomorrow, Charlie said. I will, Sandra said. Charlie set the phone down. She picked up her tea. It was cold now, but she drank it anyway. She was thinking about the 400 people who would walk into Summit Horizon on Monday morning. Some of them already knew that the ownership had changed. Some of them had heard rumors about the board meeting. Some of them had been watching the company shift in ways they didn't fully understand and had been carrying the specific anxiety of people who depend on an institution and sense that the institution is in flux. They deserved to know what was happening, not through a corporate communication that said nothing meaningful in polished language. Through something real. Charlie had been thinking about how to do that. She had been thinking about standing in front of them. About saying, in the simplest and most honest terms available, here is what was wrong, here is what we are doing about it, here is what this company is going to become, and here is why I believe it. She had done harder things. She had built a company at a kitchen table when 21 investors told her no. She had hidden her identity for 8 years in service of something she believed in. She had sat across from the man who publicly humiliated her and offered him a choice instead of a sentence. She could stand in front of 400 people and tell them the truth. She was already writing it in her head. Sandra Okafor called back in 19 hours. Not 24, 19. which told Charlie everything she needed to know about how Sandra had spent the previous evening, not vacillating, not second-guessing, but working through the decision, the way she worked through everything, systematically, without drama, with complete attention to what Fast actually said, rather than what she wished they said. "I'll do it," Sandra said without preamble. "I'm glad," Charlie said. "I have conditions," Sandra said. "I expected you would," Charlie said. "Tell me." "James comes with me as chief of staff as we discussed. Full access to all documentation and all board communications, nothing routed around me. A standing weekly meeting with you direct, no intermediaries, for the first 6 months. And I want the remediation process for affected employees to be my first official action. Not a press release, not a memo, an actual in-person conversation with each person individually or in small groups if they prefer. I want them to hear it from leadership directly." Charlie was quiet for a beat. "That last one," she said, "that's not a condition. That's exactly what I was going to ask you to do." A pause. "Then we're already aligned," Sandra said. "We are," Charlie said. "Welcome to Summit Horizon." Another pause, shorter. "That's the strangest sentence I've ever been told in my professional life," Sandra said. Charlie smiled. "Get used to it. You're going to be hearing it from 400 people very soon." The announcement of Sandra's interim appointment went to the board Wednesday morning. The responses were what Charlie had expected. Dr. Brewer responded within the hour with a one-line message that said simply, "Excellent choice." Gerald Fitch took until Thursday afternoon and said he would reserve judgment pending performance. The other 5 board members landed somewhere between those two positions, which was a reasonable distribution. What Charlie had not anticipated was the response from inside the company. She had not expected it to travel as fast as it did. By Thursday evening, Summit Horizon's internal communications channels were alive with something that wasn't quite panic and wasn't quite excitement, but was the specific heightened attention of a large group of people who understand that the ground has shifted significantly and are trying to figure out what that means for them individually and collectively. Someone had found Sandra's professional profile. Someone else had found a reference to her 22 years in forensic financial review. And then someone Charlie never found out who had connected the name Charlotte Whitmore, new owner, to the woman who had stood quietly at company events for 8 years as Daniel Carter's wife. By Friday morning, it was not quiet anymore. Margaret Holloway called Charlie directly at 8:47. Charlie answered. "You should know," Margaret said, without any introductory niceties, because Margaret Holloway had never wasted time on introductory niceties, "that the entire 14th floor has figured out who you are." Not guessing, knowing. Someone pulled the acquisition filing and found Aurelia Capital Group, and then found Aurelia Health Systems, and found a profile from a 2019 industry conference where your name and photographs and appear as the keynote speaker. Charlie had given exactly one keynote speech at a healthcare technology conference in 2019 because the organizers had been persistent and the cause had been one she genuinely cared about. And she had given it under her full name because it had felt dishonest not to. She had not imagined it would matter to anyone outside that room. "How are people responding?" she asked. Margaret was quiet for a moment. The specific quiet of someone choosing their words carefully, not because they're trying to be diplomatic, but because they're trying to be accurate. "Shocked," Margaret said, "but not negatively. I've been walking this floor for 6 years, Charlie. I know what fear sounds like in this building, and I know what relief sounds like. What I'm hearing right now is closer to relief." A pause. "People are saying things like, 'She was here the whole time. She saw it, she knew.'" Charlie absorbed that, and the people who were closer to Daniel, she asked. "His direct reports, his management circle?" "Quiet," Margaret said. "Very quiet, the kind of quiet that's working out what the new math means for them personally." "That's honest," Charlie said. "Charlie," Margaret said, and her voice shifted slightly, moving from professional to something more personal, something that carried the weight of Sears company dinners and the places and the specific loyalty that forms between people who recognize something genuine in each other across a room full of performance. I always thought there was more to you than you were letting on. I never said anything because it wasn't my place, and you clearly had your reasons. But I want you to know I'm glad it's you. I'm really glad it's you. Charlie felt that. Thank you, Margaret, she said. For every time you refilled my water glass without being asked. Margaret made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something more tender than that. You noticed. I always noticed, Charlie said. She spent Friday afternoon with Sandra and James walking through the operational structure of the first 2 weeks, the individual and small group conversations with affected employees, the all-hands meeting that needed to happen before the public announcement, the communication framework for the remediation process. Sandra had already drafted a preliminary schedule. James had already built the documentation system they would use to track each remediation case from opening to resolution. Charlie watched them work and felt the specific satisfaction of having made a decision that was right, not just in principle but in practice, the satisfaction of seeing competence meet purpose and produce something that actually moved. At one point, Sandra looked up from her notes and said, "Before the all-hands meeting, do you want to speak, or do you want me to speak?" Charlie had been thinking about this, both, she said. I go first. I tell them who I am, the real version, not the version Daniel introduced me as. Then I tell them what we found and what we're doing about it in plain language, without softening the difficult parts. Then I hand it to you, and you talk about what the company looks like from here. Sandra considered this. That's the right order, she said. I think so, Charlie said. They need to hear from the owner first. They need to understand who made the decision to dig into this and why and what I intend this company to be. And then they need to hear from the person who's actually going to lead them through the transition. Those are 2 different conversations, and they need to be presented as 2 different conversations. James looked up briefly from his laptop. For what it's worth, he said, in every restructuring I've been part of, the single biggest factor in whether employees stay engaged or disengage is whether leadership treats them like adults. Whether they tell the truth in plain language or dress it up in corporate softening until it means nothing. He paused. From what I've seen so far, that's not going to be a problem here. Charlie looked at him. No, she said, it isn't. The all-hands meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 9 in the morning. Charlie arrived at Summit Horizons headquarters at 8:15. She had never come through the main entrance as anything other than Daniel Carter's wife. She had parked in the guest lot, signed in at reception, smiled at whoever was at the front desk, and waited to be collected. This time, she walked in through the main entrance, told the front desk her name, and took the elevator to the 14th floor. The receptionist, a young woman named Keisha, who had been with the company for 2 years and who had seen Charlie exactly twice at company events, looked at her when she gave her name and then looked at her again in the specific way that people look when the information they've just received doesn't match the image they were carrying. Ms. Whitmore, Keisha said, of course, welcome. Thank you, Keisha, Charlie said. She had read the company directory. She knew the name. She saw Keisha register that. I'll let Mrs. Okafor know you're here, Keisha said. Please, Charlie said. And Keisha, I know the last few weeks have been unsettling for everyone in this building. I appreciate your patience. Keisha looked at her for a moment. Then she said, we heard you were here before, that you used to come to the events. I did, Charlie said. People are saying Keisha stopped. I'm sorry, that's probably not appropriate. What are people saying? Charlie said gently. Keisha hesitated, then that you were watching, that you already knew something was wrong. That's why you bought the company. Charlie looked at her carefully. The truth is more complicated than that, she said. But yes, I was paying attention, and what I found mattered. She paused. That's what this morning is about, Keisha nodded. Something in her face shifted, not dramatically, but in the small, specific way that faces shift when a person decides to extend trust back on a single exchange that felt real. Good luck, Keisha said. Thank you, Charlie said. And she meant it completely. She met Sandra in the corridor outside the main conference hall. James was already inside managing the audio system. Sandra was standing with a folder and her characteristic expression of calm preparedness. "How are you feeling?" Charlie asked. "Ready," Sandra said. "You've been ready since you called me back in 19 hours, Charlie said. Sandra almost smiled. "I was ready before I called. I just needed the night." They went in together. The room filled between 8:45 and 9. Charlie stood to the side of the stage and watched them come in ones and twos and small clusters. The particular body language of people entering a room where they know something significant is about to happen, but don't know exactly what shape it will take. Some of them talked quietly, some of them looked at their phones. Some of them looked at the stage with the alert attention of people who had learned, in the past several weeks, that paying attention to changes at the top of an organization was not paranoia, it was practical. Margaret Holloway came in near the end and found a seat near the front. She looked at Charlie across the room and gave a single small nod. Charlie nodded back. At 9 o'clock, the company's interim communications director, a woman named Priya who had been managing Summit Series of messaging for 3 years and who had handled the past 3 weeks with professionalism that Charlie had already noted and intended. To acknowledge properly stepped to the microphone. "Good morning," Priya said. "Thank you all for being here. Please welcome the owner of Summit Horizon Technologies, Charlotte Whitmore." Charlie walked to the microphone. The room was very quiet. She looked out at 400 people. She thought for one single second about a ballroom in October. About a ring on the floor, about the way silence had moved through a room when it was used as a weapon. This silence was different. This silence was waiting. "Good morning," Charlie said. "My name is Charlotte Whitmore. Most of you know me as Daniel Carter's wife. A few of you may have spoken to me at company events. Over the years, I was usually near the edge of the room, and I usually said I ran a small online business from home." She paused. I understated that significantly. A ripple moved through the crowd. Not laughter exactly, recognition. "I am the founder and majority owner of Aurelia Health Systems, a healthcare technology company that most of you have probably heard of even if you don't know who built it. Through Aurelia Capital Group, I acquired Summit Horizon Technologies several weeks ago. The acquisition closed on the same morning that many of you were in this building celebrating a company anniversary. I was in that room too." Another pause. "I was also the person whose ring ended up on the floor." The silence now was absolute. "I'm telling you that not for sympathy," Charlie said. "I'm telling you because you deserve honesty about who is standing in front of you and why. You deserve to understand the full context of the decisions that have been made about this company in the past several weeks, not a corporate summary, not a polished statement, but the truth." She held the room. She told them the truth. She told them about the audit. Not in forensic detail, but in human terms what the pattern of vendor contracts meant, whose names appeared in the documents, what those names meant. She told them about the employment records, about the 7 employees who had been passed over, about the 2 grievances that had been closed in 4 days without resolution. She said Renata Osi's name, with Renata's prior permission, because she had promised Nata that the record would exist somewhere, and she was making sure it existed in the most real place she had available. She told them about Marcus Webb. She told them that both Renata and Marcus were part of the remediation process that was beginning this week. She saw faces in the crowd shift and move as the information landed, some with surprise, some with a recognition that told her the stories weren't new, just newly named, newly official. Finally spoken out loud in a room where the person speaking had the authority to do something about it. "I want to be clear about one thing," Charlie said. "This company is not defined by what was done wrong. It is not defined by the people who used it as a personal instrument instead of a shared responsibility. It is defined by the 400 people in this room who came to work every day and did their jobs and built something despite system. Not because of it." She paused. "You deserved better leadership. You're going to get it." She introduced Sandra. Sandra walked to the microphone with the same focused, unhurried quality she brought to everything, the quality of someone who had nothing to perform because they had nothing to hide. She spoke for 25 minutes. She talked about the remediation process in specific operational terms. She talked about what an independent promotion review meant in practice, who would conduct it, what criteria would be applied, what the timeline was, what the possible outcomes were. She talked about the vendor contract unwind process and what it meant for the company's financial position. She talked about the governance structures that would be put in place to make sure that the approval processes, de la favor, replaced with processes that had genuine independence built into them. She did not use corporate language, she used plain language. And Charlie, watching from the side of the stage, saw the specific thing happen that she had hoped for and not quite dared to fully predict. She watched 400 people exhale. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the aggregate, room-wide. She watched the particular tension that had been living in this space for weeks, maybe longer. Maybe for the entire period during which something had been slightly off in ways that individuals felt, but couldn't officially name. She watched it begin to release. When Sandra finished, she opened the floor for questions. 22 hands went up. Charlie and Sandra answered for 48 minutes. Most of the questions were practical. What does this mean for my position, for my team, for my project, for my review cycle? A few were personal, from people who had been on the periphery of the situations the report described and wanted to understand whether their own experiences were part of the record or outside it. One question came from a young software engineer in the third row, a man who looked about 26, who raised his hand and when Sandra called on him said, "I've been here 14 months. I almost quit twice because I couldn't understand why the promotion process worked the way it did. Nobody would tell me directly, but something felt off." He paused. Is it actually going to be different, or is this a meeting? The room got very quiet around that question. Charlie stepped back to the microphone. She looked at him directly. "It's going to be different," she said. "Not because I'm telling you it will be, because the people in this room are going to hold me and Sandra and this board accountable to making it different. Ask this question again in 6 months. Ask it in a year. If the answer has changed, I want to know. If it hasn't, you deserve to say so publicly." She paused. Your question just now, saying that out loud in this room, with everyone listening, that's what this company should have always made room for. That's where we're starting. He nodded slowly. He sat back. And Margaret Holloway in the front row pressed her lips together in an expression that Charlie recognized from company dinners and shared spaces, the expression of someone who has waited a long time for something to be said and is feeling the specific weight of finally hearing it. The meeting ended at 11:17. People moved out of the room slowly, in the particular way that people move after something significant, reluctant to let the moment fully close, still processing, still absorbing. Charlie stayed at the front and spoke with whoever approached her. Some people introduced themselves. Some people shook her hand with both of theirs and didn't say anything at all. One woman, a project manager named Diane, who had been at Summit Horizon for 7 years, said, "I knew something was wrong with the Renata situation. I was her manager's manager. I recommended her for the promotion. When it didn't happen, I asked why, and I was told the decision had been made at a higher level." She stopped. "I always felt like I should have pushed harder. You did what you could within the system that existed," Charlie said. "The system failed, not you. That's an important distinction." Diane looked at her. "You really believe that?" "I do," Charlie said. "How?" Diane said. "How are you so calm about all of this?" Charlie thought about that. "I had 8 years to practice," she said. Diane considered that for a moment. Then she said, "I want to be part of building what comes next. Whatever that looks like, I want to be part of it." "Good," Charlie said. "We're going to need people who remember what the wrong version looked like. It's the best insurance against repeating it." By early afternoon, the building had changed temperature. Not literally, but in the way that organizations have a felt quality, a climate, that has nothing to do with the thermostat and everything to do with what people believe about the institution they're inside Summit. Horizon felt different than it had in the morning. Less tight, more honest, the kind of institutional feeling that Charlie had spent years trying to build at Aurelia, the feeling of a place that was trying to be what it said it was. It was a beginning, she knew that. She wasn't naive about the distance between a meeting that went well and a culture that was genuinely transformed. Cultures changed slowly, unevenly, through the accumulation of thousands of small decisions made differently than they would have been made before. It took years. It required vigilance and consistency and the willingness to be uncomfortable when the wrong decision was the easier one. She knew all of that, but beginnings mattered. The quality of a beginning shaped everything that followed. And this beginning had been honest, which was the only quality that could not be retrofitted later. 2 weeks after the all-hands meeting, Renata Osais came back to Summit Horizon. Not as an employee, not yet, and maybe not ever, because that was a choice that belonged entirely to Renata, and Charlie had been careful to make that clear. She came in for a meeting with Sandra, as part of the formal individual conversations that Sandra had committed to as her first official action. Charlie was not in that meeting. It was not her meeting to be in. But she was on the 14th floor when Renata arrived. And she stepped out of the conference room she'd been working in and crossed the corridor and said hello. Renata looked at her for a moment, then she said, "You look different here." "In this building, I feel different here," Charlie said. "You look like you belong," Renata said. Charlie considered that. "I think I'm just not pretending," she said. Renata smiled a real smile, the kind that has something complicated behind it but is still genuinely a smile. "I'll take that," she said. Marcus Webb's conversation with Sandra happened the following week, and afterward Marcus sent Charlie a brief email. It said the record existed. "You made it matter, thank you." She read it 3 times. She wrote back one sentence, "Thank you for keeping it." 3 weeks after the board meeting, Daniel Carter's resignation was made public. The statement was measured, prepared by his attorney, and acknowledged what it needed to acknowledge, without excessive detail. The press coverage was significant. For about 72 hours his name appeared in Pacific Northwest business publications, with the specific kind of coverage that attaches itself to a fall from prominence. The kind that is not kind but is also not inaccurate. Charlie did not comment on it. She had been asked by 2 journalists for a response. She had declined both times, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had already said everything that needed to be said in the rooms where it actually mattered, to the people to whom it was actually owed. A quote in a publication was not the same as that. It was not the right container for what had happened, and she had learned over many years of understanding what power was actually for, that putting things in the wrong container was how they lost their meaning. The story would be told accurately enough by the record. The record was 114 pages long and fully sourced, and would stand up to any scrutiny it received. Her name was in it as the owner. That was sufficient. On a Thursday evening in late February, 4 months after the ballroom, Charlie drove to Portland. She didn't call ahead. She rarely did. Her mother had always said that calling ahead gave people time to prepare a version of themselves instead of just being themselves, and Elizabeth Whitmore was interested in actual people, not their prepared versions. She knocked on the door of the small house her mother had lived in for 23 years. Elizabeth answered in her reading glasses and a cardigan, with a paperback mystery in one hand, and the expression of someone who had been expecting exactly this visit, even though no one had mentioned it. "You drove all the way down," Elizabeth said. "I needed to," Charlie said. Elizabeth stepped back and let her in. They sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Elizabeth had made her list on the night Charlie's father left. The same table where Charlie had done homework for 12 years. The same table where Elizabeth had told her, "Never let anyone decide your value. Build something that belongs to you." Elizabeth made tea. She set a mug in front of Charlie and sat down across from her. "Tell me how you are," she said, "not what happened." "How you are." Charlie wrapped both hands around the mug. She thought about the ballroom, about the ring, about Sandra's report, about the board meeting, about Renata's smile in the corridor, about the young software engineer in the third row who had asked if things were actually going to be different and had deserved a real answer. She thought about 8 years of choosing to be invisible. She thought about what it had cost her, and what it had given her, and whether she would make the same choice, again knowing what it led to. The answer to that last question was complicated, and she held it honestly. She looked at her mother. "I'm clear," she said. "I'm tired in the way you're tired after you've done something that took everything you had. But I'm clear." Elizabeth looked at her over the rim of her mug. "Are you happy?" Charlie was quiet for a moment. "I think I'm getting there," she said. "I think I'm closer to it than I've been in a long time. Because I'm not hiding anymore, and hiding even when you do it for good reasons takes something from you. It takes the part of you that gets to be fully seen." She paused. "I want to be fully seen for a while." Elizabeth set down her mug. She reached across the table and put her hand over Charlie's. She didn't say anything, because Elizabeth Whitmore understood that some moments did not need to be commented on. They just needed to be witnessed. They sat like that for a while. The tea cooled, the evening settled around the small house. And Charlotte Whitmore, who had built an empire at a kitchen table, who had hidden herself for 8 years in service of a love that was real and then wasn't, who had walked out of a ballroom with a ring on the floor behind her, and used every hour that followed to protect 400 people she had never met from a system that had been failing them quietly for years, sat across from the woman who had taught her everything that mattered and let herself be seen. Completely, honestly, without reduction. 2 months later, Sandra Okafor accepted the permanent CEO position at Summit Horizon Technologies. The independent promotion review was completed and resulted in 6 formal remediation offers. 4 were accepted. Renata Osi accepted hers. Marcus Webb accepted a consulting role with the company's new compliance advisory structure because he said he'd rather help build the right system from the outside than occupy a seat inside it. And because that was exactly the kind of answer Marcus Webb would give, and Charlie thought it was right for him. Gerald Fitch resigned from the board at the end of the quarter. She was replaced by Dr. Brewer's recommendation, a woman with a background in corporate governance and a reputation that needed no qualifying footnotes. Aurelia Health Systems continued operating, expanding into 3 additional state healthcare networks because Charlie had never stopped running it, even through everything, because the work had never stopped mattering. And the ballroom at the Cascade Grand stayed in her memory not as a wound but as a marker, the precise moment when the last thing she needed to let go of finally fell away, and what was underneath it turned out to be more solid than anything she had been holding on to. She had not needed to be rescued. She had not needed to be validated. She had not needed anyone to finally see her worth and declare it. She had only needed to stop hiding it, and the woman who had spent 8 years being the quiet wife, standing at the edge of every room, turned out to have been, all along, the most powerful person in it. That was not a conclusion she had fought for. It was simply the truth, and the truth, as her mother had always known, does not require anyone's permission to exist. It only requires someone with the courage to say it out loud. Charlotte Whitmore had always had that courage. She had simply been saving it for exactly the right moment, and the moment when it came had been enough.